Welcome to History in Audio. I'm Hugo.
And I'm Paul. Today we're tackling an event that is a masterclass in paradox, a rebellion so disastrous in its execution that it became one of the most significant political victories in modern history. We are talking about the Easter Rising of 1916 in Dublin.
A spectacular failure that somehow succeeded? That sounds like our kind of story. So, Paul, set the scene. Ireland in 1916. What's the mood?
Hence, for decades the dominant political issue was Home Rule, essentially self-government for Ireland within the British Empire. A bill for it had finally passed in 1914, but with two huge caveats. First, Unionists in Ulster, who were fiercely loyal to Britain, formed their own militia, the Ulster Volunteers, to resist it by force. Second, the whole thing was immediately shelved because of the First World War.
Right. Put a pin in Irish independence, chaps. There's a war on.
Exactly. But this created a vacuum. More radical nationalists who didn't want Home Rule, but a fully independent Irish Republic, saw their chance. You had several groups in this militant camp: the Irish Volunteers, the main nationalist militia; the Irish Citizen Army, a smaller socialist group led by James Connolly; and pulling the strings in secret, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB.
So, while most of the country is waiting for the war to end, a small group is plotting something much bigger.
A very small, very secret group within the IRB. The whole operation was orchestrated by a 7-man military council. These were men who would become the signatories of the Proclamation: the poet and schoolmaster Patrick Pearse, the veteran Fenian Thomas Clarke, the socialist leader James Connolly, John McDiarmada, Thomas MacDonagh, Eamon Kant, and Joseph Plunkett. They kept their plans so secret that even the leader of their own militia, the Irish Volunteers, had no idea what was truly being planned. Okay, that sounds like a recipe for chaos. What was the grand plan? The plan had two main components. First, a nationwide uprising of the Irish Volunteers timed for Easter Sunday, and second, and this was crucial, a massive shipment of arms from Germany. Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat, had arranged for a ship called the Liebau, disguised as a Norwegian vessel named the Aud, to land 20,000 rifles on the coast of Kerry.
20,000 rifles? That's a game changer. I have a feeling this doesn't go smoothly.
Doesn't go smoothly is an understatement, Hugo. It was a complete fiasco. The arms ship arrived early. The local volunteers weren't there to meet it. The British Navy, tipped off by intelligence, intercepted it, and the captain scuttled the ship, sending all 20,000 rifles to the bottom of the sea. To top it off, Roger Casement was captured almost as soon as he landed from a German U-boat.
Wow, so the whole plan is dead in the water. No guns, no nationwide rising.
It gets worse, Hugo. The IRB plotters, trying to force the hand of the more moderate volunteer leader, Eoin MacNeill, forged a document called the Castle Document, which supposedly detailed a British plan to arrest them all. When MacNeill learned that this was a trick and that the arms shipment had been lost, he was furious. He placed an ad in the Sunday newspaper canceling all volunteer maneuvers for Easter Sunday. The leaders were faced with a choice: call it all off or go ahead with a fraction of the men, no chance of victory, and only in Dublin.
And they chose to go ahead anyway. Why? Was it a blood sacrifice?
That's exactly how Pearse saw it. He believed that the spirit of Irish nationalism needed to be reawakened by the martyrdom of patriots. So, on Easter Monday, a day later than planned, about 1,200 rebels mustered in Dublin. They were a motley crew, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothes with just an armband, armed mostly with antiquated rifles.
So, paint the picture. What does this look like on the streets of Dublin?
It was surreal. The rebels seized key buildings across the city to form a defensive ring. Eamon de Valera commanded Boland's Mill. Michael Mallon and Countess Markievicz took St. Stephen's Green, and Eamon Kent held the South Dublin Union. The headquarters was the most impressive building of all, the General Post Office, the GPO, right in the heart of the city.
The post office, not a military barracks or Dublin castle, the very heart of British rule.
It was symbolic. The GPO was the nerve centre of British communication. From its steps, Patrick Pearse read the Proclamation of the Irish Republic to a crowd of confused and, in many cases, hostile onlookers.
Strategically, though, it seems a bit odd. They didn't even try to capture Dublin Castle, the centre of British rule, which was apparently lightly defended, or Trinity College, a major strategic point in the city centre. Hostile? They weren't cheering?
Not at first. Many Dubliners had relatives fighting for the British in the Great War. They saw this as a stab in the back. The British were caught completely by surprise, but their response when it came was overwhelming.
How overwhelming are we talking?
It was within days they had amassed over 16,000 troops. They brought in heavy artillery. They even sailed a gunboat, the Helga, up the River Liffey and started shelling the city centre. Liberty Hall was destroyed, and soon the shells began raining down on the GPO.
They shelled their own second city of the empire? That's a brutal response.
It was. The fighting was fierce, particularly at Mount Street Bridge, where just 17 volunteers held off thousands of British soldiers for hours, inflicting hundreds of casualties. But the outcome was never in doubt. By Saturday, the GPO was on fire, and the rebel leaders, now operating from a house on Moore Street, realized it was hopeless. Pearse issued an unconditional surrender.
So it's over. A military failure, just as predicted. But you said this is where the story turned.
This is the pivot. The British, under General Maxwell, decided to make an example of the leaders. Instead of just imprisoning them, they held a series of secret courts-martial and began executing them by firing squad in the stonebreakers' yard of Kilmainham Gaol. A day after day the news came out. Pearse, Clark, MacDonough, Plunkett, who married his sweetheart in the prison chapel hours before he was shot. The public mood, which had been hostile to the rebels, began to change.
You can see why. It starts to look less like justice and more like vengeance.
And there were other atrocities. A British officer, Captain Bowen Coltshurst, summarily executed a well-known pacifist and writer, Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who wasn't even involved in the rising. He was later found guilty, but insane. This kind of event horrified people.
Right, that's just murder.
But the final act was the execution of James Connolly. He had been so severely wounded in the fighting, with a shattered ankle, that he couldn't stand. The British military carried him on a stretcher to the yard, tied him to a chair, and then shot him.
They tied a wounded man to a chair to execute him. That is an incredibly powerful and awful image.
It was the breaking point. The execution stopped after Connolly, but the damage was done. The British had turned the rebel leaders from, in the eyes of many, dangerous zealots into national martyrs. Pearse had his blood sacrifice, courtesy of the British Army.
So let's do some myth-busting. I've heard this called the Sinn Féin Rebellion. Is that accurate?
Not at all. It's a classic case of mistaken identity. Sinn Féin at the time was a small, non-violent nationalist political party. They had virtually nothing to do with the planning of the rising. But the British press and government needed a label, and Sinn Féin was the one they used. Ironically, the rising's new supporters flocked to the real Sinn Féin party afterwards, transforming it into the dominant force of republicanism.
So the British basically did their PR for them, which brings us to the big what if. What if General Maxwell had just imprisoned the leaders? No execution.
It's one of history's great counterfactuals. Without the martyrdom, the rising likely would have been remembered as a foolish, failed insurrection. Public opinion wouldn't have shifted so dramatically. Sinn Féin wouldn't have had its landslide victory in the 1918 election. The subsequent Irish War of Independence might never have happened, or would have been a much smaller affair.
That's fascinating. The entire course of Irish history was changed not by the Rising itself, but by the British reaction to it.
Precisely. The Easter Rising lasted 6 days. It ended in total military defeat, with parts of Dublin in ruins and nearly 500 people dead, most of them civilians. Yet within 5 years, that defeat was transformed into the political reality of an independent Irish state. It's a stark reminder that in history, the aftermath of a battle can be far more important than the battle itself.
A truly paradoxical event. That's all the time we have for today on History in Audio. Join us next time.